version of a whole.
All right, good afternoon to all, and welcome to Seminar 8 of Year 3 of our Maximos Seminar. We are with the volume on difficulties in sacred scriptures, the responses to Thalassios. And we're on question and response 25, 26, and 27 today. So it's a few more pages than before, pages 163 through 189. The themes today are horizon. Horizon is the first theme. And clearing. We're going to play a little bit with clearing, both as a kind of activity and as a kind of place. So horizon, clearing. Kinesis, or movement, is the third theme. And hierarchy. We return to the theme of hierarchy. And then finally, last time we asked, what does it mean to kind of think in terms of transformation or think transformatively? So we're going to speak about transformation or transfiguration this time too. Maximus has given us immense, he always does, but it's palpably more immense today. So we approach him with gratitude and with humility and with reverence for the mystery that he's ushering us into. I want to begin where we kind of paused last time, or at least we dwelt there. This is with Scholia 6 of question 22. Michael brought this to our attention in a lovely way last session. Let's read it and think a little bit as a way into what we're going to talk about now. So this is page 155, just over to 156. It's a Scholia, so it's a comment that is added to the main body of the text. Scholia 6 on page 155 over to 156. We cease to accomplish the virtues, he says, after this present life, but on a higher level than that of the virtues, we never cease passively to experience divinization by grace. For this experience, which transcends nature, is infinite, and so is always active and effective, whereas a passive experience, contrary to nature, is without real existence and so is inefficacious. Now, Maximus seems here to be challenging the kind of assumption which we have challenged before, that we understand our life to be one of activity up until death and then a cessation of all movement. Maximus is saying that that's not how it is. It doesn't end like that. And so a scholia like this, which is a kind of accent on the text, reminds us how we could possibly misunderstand movement and meaning. It accents the text, or kind of emphasizes. What does it emphasize, or what does it mean to emphasize here? Part of the harmony of the whole is drawn near, but without negation. So emphasis here means part of the harmony of the whole is drawn near, but without negation. And what's Maximus talking about in this scholia? He's talking about the life of virtue, right? Or the life of arete, the Greek word, which also can mean excellence. So he's talking about a life of excellence. And he says, the life of excellence that we know here doesn't just come to a halt and then we undergo something else. It continues, but what does it mean to continue? Well, excellence, or to excel, is that which is surpassing, right? Excellence is a form of apophatic movement here. And so when Maximus is phrasing virtue and the ongoing experience of divinization or deification, he is figuring the horizon of our energy, or of our synergy, rather. He's saying, don't mistake the horizon of energy, or don't mistake the horizon of synergy for your own horizon of perceived energy. When we think in terms of active and passive, just in terms of our own energy, our mortal being. Time is our horizon, which means that we are being unto death. And Maximus is saying in this Scholia, time is not the horizon. Things continue somehow harmoniously. So beyond the horizon of time or death, in which horizon do we make and experience, so to speak? We noted last session that the words translated as active or activity and passive or passivity are rich words that have roots, palpable Greek roots in the term for making, poiesis, or experiencing, undergoing, pascha. Now, the horizon that is not of death, that is not of time, is of Christ. And so we can think of the horizon of Christ as excellence. The horizon of Christ as excellence. Think of and as in that phrase. Horizon of Christ as excellence. It's known as excellence. It's not contained or confined by that, but it is of Christ. And so this means that the horizon we are given is one of surpassing or transformation. Our own surpasses its own. Our own becomes greater, becomes unto his own in the horizon of Christ. Within the horizon of Christ, we both seek and find things surpassing themselves in the mode of transformation or transfiguration. Last time we said that maybe the words horizon and Christ and aletheia actually mean the same thing for us. It's the place where beautiful transfiguration occurs. Christ is our horizon and Christ is our truth. So the horizon of Christ is our truth. In the horizon, all dance as one in transfigured beauty. In the same way, in our phrasing is a kind of sensible horizon or intelligible horizon. All dances as one in transformed beauty. So in the phrase, we seek transformation. In the horizon, we seek and partake of transfiguration. Now, emphasis within this horizon draws near as present. To emphasize or emphasis within this horizon draws near as present and recognizes preeminence. Maximus uses the term preeminent. It's going to be important for our comprehension of hierarchy. It's how he distinguishes. So emphasis draws near as present, but emphasis also recognizes preeminence in the horizon or the phrase, but it still does not negate. So emphasis draws near, recognizes preeminence, but does not negate. In the horizon, then, presence is a form of emphasis, a form or mode or tropos of drawing near in beauty, not just standing or sitting there. Presence is not just standing or sitting there, it's drawing near. It's a form of emphasis, movement without negation. But presence only makes beautiful sense when it is of Christ's horizon, right? When it is presence of Christ's horizon. And this is always presence for the sake of, or presence unto. And for the sake of or unto the beautiful meaning which is given by Christ as the truth of our horizon. So presence is participative in the sense. For the sake of means relationship or movement, presence in movement, presence in relationship. And movement unto, presence for the sake of, movement unto, is a form of gathering. Gathering. So in a way, presence involves a gathering, a concentration, an integrity for the sake of. One is most oneself with others in one's gathering, in one's concentration, in one's integrity. Moreover, presence means both calling and dwelling appropriately. So, regarding the integrity of calling and dwelling in an horizon, there is a need for our of and our as to be one. In other words, there's no dwelling without calling, and there's no calling without dwelling, no proper dwelling without calling, and no proper calling without dwelling. We recall that to call out, forms part of the sense of the Greek word to kalon, which is commonly translated as the good or the beautiful. It has a sense of calling unto us too. And so the beautiful is that which calls out unto us, draws us near, right? But what kind of beauty is calling us? If it is a beauty of Christ, it is blessed. But if it is the beauty of Antichrist, who looks just like Christ, then it is negative. And so either beauty calls us to truth, to aletheia, to what we are calling the clearing, or beauty calls us unto falsehood, unto lies, unto devilish negation of our being. Part of our comprehension of the kind of call depends on how we know kinesis, how we know movement. So, as the topos of dwelling and calling, as the place of dwelling and calling, the clearing is the place of apophatic kinesis, of transformation or transfiguration. So as the topos of dwelling and calling, the clearing is the scene of apophatic kinesis, of transformation or of transfiguration. This means that this clearing, in order not to be negation, draws us into the transfiguration of our sense of movement, of our sense of kinesis. This is what Scholia 6 is talking about. Our sense of movement or kinesis is transfigured in the truth of Christ. If we think of movement as movement, if our habit is movement as movement, then we are stuck in the as, the aesthetic. There's no noetic element, and so we're stuck in idolatry. We love movement just for movement. If we think of the movement of stillness, or the kinesis of stasis, what does this mean? This means that movement is noetically realized as stasis. The movement is of, or gains its authority from, stasis, the kinesis of stasis. And so in a way of phrasing it, this is the excellent horizon of the truth of Christ. Movement which is natural to us, surpassing its own in the apophatic clearing of Christ's aletheia, Christ's truth. And the energy of this clearing, of this place of aletheia, of this horizon, is synergy. It's kinesis as stasis, and stasis as kinesis. And we already have a term for this, which we learned at the very beginning, which is ever-moving repose. Right? It's a kind of paradoxical image we have, or apophatic image we have for what we understand to be the fulfillment of kinesis and stasis. Ever-moving repose, or the communion of integral being. Now, in question 25, Maximus plays a lot with the noetic and the aesthetic, or of and as, or of intellect and sensation. So let's think just a moment about this. We can say that in the clearing, or in being, the truth of our being, the gift is co-respondence or co-response, not assertion and negation. So first, of and as are meant to correspond. In the clearing, in being, the noetic and the aesthetic are transfigured together. They come together, and together they become something transfigured. Or, to put another way, our movements of intellect, the nous, of, and our movements of sensation, or aesthesis, or as, are blessed together, not apart, together. And in question and response 25, Maximus illustrates this beautifully by speaking of man and woman in analogous ways to nous and aesthesis, or noetic and aesthetic, or of and as. And so we have a slightly refreshed way to speak of the way that nous and aesthesis, or noetic and aesthetic reality, are blessed together in terms of the intimate relationship of persons, the most intimate of unions that we know. So what can we kind of say about this line of thinking? When thinking of negation, considering even the idea of negation, in what we're calling the clearing, or with the clearing, or as the clearing, negation really means transformation of our comprehensions. So when Maximus talks about negating beings, or what have you, it means a transformation. The clearing, aletheia, the place of truth, doesn't negate anything. But the clearing is the place where things aren't as they are elsewhere and otherwise. They just are different there, but different not in the sense of not themselves. They just aren't as we know them otherwise. They're clarified, they're in communion. And so when we try to enter or consider this clearing, we are engaged in thinking as transformation. And that just means thinking in the sense of drawing near and partaking of the movement of things and people unto beauty. So just a few more thoughts before moving to the text. Negation in the Greek diction often comes to us in this text through the form of alpha, and then a privative form, not this, this. One of the advantages of this word clearing is in English diction, its form doesn't involve withdrawal or the negation of anything in the word. The movement itself isn't a without, or a movement of bereaving somebody of something. The clearing means to clear aside first, to clear aside, to make room. Then it also means to clarify. So to clear aside, to clarify, and to draw into a place of presence, right? If things are clearing, it's drawing us into a place of presence, and it means and is that place of presence. So it both is a thing that is an energy, and it is a thing that is a state. It is both a kinesis, a movement, and a stasis, a topos. And in the clearing, in the truth of Christ, in the horizon of Christ, all encounter transforms. All encounter transforms. And so relation is about mine own unto his own, not improving my place, not trying to get ahead or get up. So what does this teach us about hierarchy? About appropriate relation? Hierarchy is just about appropriate relation. It's about the transformation and the mutual enjoyment of divine gifts. Right? It's within that the movement happens, and it's within that the hierarchy has meaning. And so the clearing, as the place of transfiguration, or as a place of transfigurative encounter, reveals or clarifies his own beauty in my own, in your own, in her own, in his own person. It clarifies for us. The truth of Christ clarifies his beauty in another. In the sense of hierarchy, then, harmony is what renders a form appropriate. Things are transfigured into a beautiful communion in the hierarchy. And when the harmony of the hierarchy is of Christ, then we have simple form. When the harmony of the hierarchy is of Christ, as beautiful, we have simple form. Okay. Now, question 25 and responses are about simple form. But we approach it in composite ways. So let's turn to this now. This is page 163. Page 163. It's question 25. I'm going to just give a few remarks, and then we'll read the whole thing, taking turns, beginning with Goa, and then Jennings, and then Burke, and then myself. We'll just take turns. But a few overview thoughts first. This question and response is about emphasis within a phrase. It's not about an act that is good or bad, because veiling or unveiling, covered and uncovered, it depends on the phrase. The meaning of that act or that event is seen as beautiful within the phrase, right? Within the horizon of Christ, transformative. The movement is explicitly covering or uncovering, or veiling or unveiling, which are images that we use for truth as well, often, or have been used for truth as well, in the Christian tradition and beyond the Christian tradition. And the response is about intimacy. It's about proximity. And the path of drawing near, the path of synergy. Maximus also well, I'm not sure if introduces, but he uses it strongly here in ways he hasn't before, the word preeminence as a way of pointing to emphasis within relation. It's a kind of provisional way of linking movement and stasis. Also, in this response, Maximus addresses is and is called, or stasis and kinesis. And in really remarkable ways, here, I think more than anywhere else, Maximus illuminates apophatic movements. movement from within and with and through and beyond its own movements. So the stasis he gives us in this response is a kind of the stasis of fire. It's a stasis of something that is effervescent and constantly moving. It's about the transformation of movement. Most palpably, though, it is about hierarchy and authority, because the question is assuredly asked, in the sense of we have to be careful about assigning relative value to singular roles. And Maximus is saying that's not how we understand hierarchy. But let's read it through, please. David, if I could ask you to begin, and would you please read the question and then just the first paragraph, 25.2, and then Jennings, please, the next 25.3, and then Michael, 25.4, and then I'll join in 25.5, and then go Jennings, Michael. Please, David.
Well, the question, what is the meaning of the words? But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a woman is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Any man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled dishonors her head. It is the same as if her head were shaven. And what, moreover, is the meaning of, this is why a woman ought to have a veil on her head, because of the angels. The response. One should know that when the divine apostle said that Christ is the head of every man, he obviously means of every believing man who is engaged in the practice of the divine commandments and who contemplates pious doctrines, because the inclusive sense of the word does not include men who are not believers. For how could Christ be the head of those who do not believe in him?
Thus, according to one interpretation, employing the principle of anagogy, we state that man here signifies the intellect, engaged in practice, having as its head the rationale of faith. Looking to this head as if it were Christ, the intellect establishes its own proper life, being built up through aesthetic practice by the graces of the commandments, and does not dishonor its head, that is, its faith, by any external material veil or covering, placing nothing transitory and fleeting above the faith. The wife of such an intellect is, we say, the very habit of aesthetic practice, richly adorned and veiled with many diverse aesthetical thoughts and practices. Or, rather, she has as her veil the intellect itself, which is her proper head, according to the abundance and beauty of these thoughts and manners. And we say that Christ is substantive faith, whose head is clearly God, to whom the rationale of faith leads, showing to those being led the God in whom he exists by nature.
Paragraph 25, and again, man is the intellect diligently engaged in natural contemplation in the spirit, having as its head the Creator Word, who is revealed by faith through the beautiful order of visible realities. Such an intellect, man, does not dishonor the Word by covering it and placing it, as it were, beneath anything visible. Neither does it make anything else whatsoever higher than the word. The wife of this intellect is the power of sensation that dwells with it, through which the intellect ranges over the nature of sensible realities. From these latter, the intellect gathers together the more divine principles, but it does not allow sensation to be stripped of its rational coverings, lest it become the servant of irrationality and sin, by rejecting the covers of the more divine principles, and exchange its head, the intellect, for the passion of irrationality. But the head of Christ, that is the creator word, who appears proportionately in beings by means of the natural contemplation of creatures, is the ineffable intellect that begets him according to essence, in relation to whom the word, through himself, firmly establishes the human intellect that is elevated to him through the pious contemplation of beings, providing it with intelligible reflections of divine realities in proportion to its knowledge of visible ones.
And then just read Scholia 5, Michael. The others so far are not essential, but read Scholia 5, which was just at the end of that, of your reading there.
Yeah. Scholia 5. Inasmuch as the intellect, he says, is conceived of simultaneously with the word that created beings, to which the word refers all beings as their cause, he called God, the Father, the head of Christ, like an intellect naturally bringing forth a word.
Okay. 25.5. From still another perspective, man is the intellect, the nous, that has entered into mystical theology, having Christ as its uncovered head, who, by means of initiations beyond demonstration, is understood in a manner beyond knowledge, or, to speak strictly, whose uncovered head is the word of faith known in a manner beyond intellection. And there are two scholia here. At the very beginning of the sentence, Maximus says, Scholia 6 says, man is also the one who is taught mystical theology. And then at the end of the phrase, is understood in a manner beyond knowledge, or to speak strictly, whose uncovered head is the word of faith known in a manner beyond intellection. Maximus says, understand the phrase in a manner beyond intellection, according to preeminence, for our faith, by which I mean God, is a reality beyond intellection. There's one of the moments of apophatic clarity of movement right there. All right, continuing in the main text, 165. Above this, such an intellect places nothing from beings, neither sensation, nor reason, nor intellect, I guess that means itself, nor intellection, nor knowledge, nor anything known, thought, or capable of being spoken, nor what is sensible or sensed, inasmuch as it cooperates with the praiseworthy and transcendent privation, which transcends both itself and beings, and which is preeminently divinizing. Now we have a footnote under the term transcendent privation, and we come to understand that the Greek term, our translator reminds us that it signifies not absolute privation, but rather superabundance. And so transcendent privation, close to what we mean by clearing some room. But after the word privation, Maximus has a scholia. Here's Maximus' scholia, number 8, page 169. He says, here he is saying that if a person, in a manner beyond cognition, by means of the preeminent negation, clearing, of created beings, has received the immediate vision of the word that transcends every word, then that same person has the word as his head, that is, the absolutely unique word, beyond or with whom or after whom no other word, no other logos, wholly alien to it in nature, has ever existed. No other word, no other logos, wholly alien to it in nature has ever existed. For the begetter of this word is the intellect, the nous, which is single in nature, and to whom, as the head, the word through the spirit, with whom he is consubstantial, elevates the intellect that follows him. The wife of this intellect is the mind which purifies itself of every sensory image, inasmuch as it has the intellect as its head, thickly covered with intuitions, without origin and beyond understanding, of ineffable and unknowable doctrines. This sentence has a scholia after the wife of this intellect. This is scholia 9. The wife of the practical intellect is, he says, its habitual state of mind, stasis, since it gives birth to the modes of virtues. The wife of the natural intellect is sensation, kinesis, made noble by the principles of the spirit, inasmuch as it gives birth to dispassionate images of beings. The wife of the theological intellect is the pure mind, since the latter is receptive of the one thrice radiant light in a single manner. Three images of synergy. Really beautifully put. Back to the main text. But the head of Christ, that is, of the word that is mystically manifested according to its preeminence, is the nous, absolutely and in all ways infinitely separated from all things, which Christ makes known to those who are worthy, since he is the natural word of this intellect, this nous. For he who has seen me, Christ says, has seen the Father. After the phrase, but the head of Christ, at the beginning of that sentence, is the scholia 10. It's about the phrase head of Christ, which sounds strange. Scholia 10. He calls the superessential and superessentially incarnate, isn't that wonderful? Superessential and superessentially incarnate word Christ. For by means of natural reason, the intellect cannot comprehend even his incarnation. The head of the word, he says, is the intellect that is caused by nature, which is causally understood together with the word from the point of view of both nature and causation. For the one who by faith has timelessly seen the word has also mystically seen, simultaneously with the word, the intellect that begot him. For the latter is in the former, according to essence. Some people might say that Christ refers to the humanity of Christ, since he is the head of all, that is, the whole of nature, and it is clear that the head of Christ's human aspect is his divinity. For by naming the parts with the name of the whole, they set forth the correct understanding of the matter. Back to the main text, page 166. For he who has seen me, he says, has seen the Father. For truly the intellect's understanding of the word becomes the clear knowledge of the intellect that begot him, since he shows that the intellect subsists in himself essentially, and it is to this intellect, this nous, that he leads the nous that desires identity with God by grace, insofar as it has been released from the diversity and quantity it apprehended intellectually in the multiplicity of beings, and is now gathered together. I love that. Released from what it apprehended, and is now gathered together into deiform unity by means of the identity and simplicity of its perpetual and intensive motion around God. And there's one more scholia in that sentence, scholia 11. Oh, this is amazing. The perfected intellects, the perfected nous, the nous which has its telos, fullness. The perfected intellect's identity with God by grace is the simple and indivisible motion around that which is identical by nature, with respect to which there is no acquisition of intelligible realities that differ according to the quantity of their substance or the quality of their potency, but rather the ineffable enjoyment possessing a sensation that transcends intellection, something aesthetic that transcends something noetic, but is still unspeakable, ineffable. David, please.
Thus, every intellect engaged in ascetic practice, when it prays or prophesies, that is, when it seeks, as if in petition, the inner principles of the virtues, for thus one must understand praise, or when it manifests their mode by its deeds, for thus one must take prophecies, ought to see nothing but the naked principle of faith, neither understanding nor thinking, nor doing anything to cover its head, as it has been summoned to by placing something else above it. And we have Scalia 12 and 13 there. So Scalia 12, he calls the prayer of the practical intellect its petition for the virtues, while he calls prophecy the true teaching concerning the principles contained in the virtues. He says that the prayer of the natural intellect is its petition for the true knowledge of beings, while its prophecies is the transmission of this knowledge to others through true teaching. The prayer of the theological intellect is ineffable silence, according to which the intellect, preeminently through the privation of beings, becomes worthy of the union that is beyond understanding and knowledge, while its prophecies is its initiation of others into this union. For prayer to God brings about the union of the one praying with God, while prophecy for the sake of God persuades the one prophesying to share with others the good things that have been given to him. Back to the main text. And every wife, that is, the habitual state of the intellect engaged in ascetic practice, when it prays or prophecies, that is, when it is secretly moved according to its disposition, or when it gives form to its virtue through its external behavior without the discernment of reason, dishonors its head, pursuing the good in a passionate manner, since it is deprived of the beautifying presence of reason that covers it like a veil. And every intellect engaged in the exercise of natural contemplation, when it either prays or prophesies with its head covered, that is, when it cognitively seeks after the principles of beings or imparts them to others through teaching, along with any kind of inclination in any manner whatsoever, toward anything but the goal consistent with piety, dishonors its head, for it has placed something transient above right knowledge consistent with piety. And every wife, that is sensation, which is naturally oriented towards objects of sense, when it does not have its head covered all round with the intellective principle of visible realities, dishonors its head, passionately approaching contemplation through its natural relation to visible realities. And every intellect that has become a lover of mystical theology, when it prays or prophesies with its head covered, that is, if when seeking without cognition to enter into the innermost contemplation, or when teaching and initiating others into theology, it should introduce some intelligible form in the course of being, initiated or initiating others into the word beyond intellection, dishonors its head, placing the one who is simple and who transcends every intellection beneath a created being or object of knowledge, whereas without eyes it can see the true God, the Word, naked of every concept and knowledge, knowing clearly that, in the case of God, it is rather the preeminent privations that hold true, and to a certain extent affirm something positive of the divine through the complete negation of beings. And there are two scholias there, 14 and 15. So 14. When he says, we speak affirmatively about the divine, together with it, we simultaneously think of beings, but only insofar as the divine is the cause of their creation. When, on the other hand, we completely negate the divine from beings, we do not think of the divine even as their cause, for to speak truly, it has no relation to beings, for it is according to relation that we naturally speak of two related things together. It follows that the good theologian will make preeminent unknowing the affirmation of the true knowledge of God, who is absolutely beyond intellection. And then Scholia 15. He says that the preeminent privations give us a small amount of positive knowledge, for they only show that God exists, but they deny that he is any of those things that exist or are able to be understood, able to be thought, able to be spoken. Back to the main text. And every wife, being the discursive faculty of such an intellect, When it prays or prophesies with its head uncovered, that is, untethered from its intellective power, which is thickly covered with mystical contemplations, dishonors its head, casting aside the divine and ineffable knowledge which covers the intellect, the noose like a head.
Every man, then, by which I mean every intellect engaged in ascetic practice, natural contemplation, or theology, when it prays or prophesizes, that is, when it is teaching or being taught, should have Christ, who is its head, uncovered. Thus, the intellect engaged in ascetic practice should prefer nothing over faith and virtue. The intellect engaged in natural contemplation should hold no other principle higher than the first principle. And the theological intellect should give no outward shape based on intellections derived from created beings to the one who is beyond intellection and knowledge. And let every woman, that is, the habitual state of the practical intellect, or the sensation of the natural intellect, or the wise mind of the theological intellect, keep her head covered. Let the first be covered by the discernment of reason concerning what and must not be done. Let the second be covered by reason's capacity for the highest degree of understanding when examining visible realities. And let the third have the completely indemonstrable knowledge of realities beyond intellection. For every habit, perception, or mind not covered in the manner mentioned above, in no way differs from a head that is shaved, that is, which possesses no principle of virtue, reverence for God, mystical knowledge, or divine love.
25:8. Every such woman, therefore, is always obliged, as is only natural, to have the authority of reason on her head, by which I mean rational oversight, and certainly on account of the angels who hold our visible and invisible moments and who keep a record of every thought and action onto our praise or censure for the dread day of examination. And also on account of the thoughts of the conscience, these also being understood figuratively as angels, either accusing us for our deeds or defending us both now and later on the day of judgment. And finally, on account of the wicked angels who observe our habitual disposition, perception, and mind, so that when they see us stripped naked of both rational and intellective discernment, as well as piety and knowledge, they will put in place what gives rise to their contraries. I mean the lack of discernment, impiety, and ignorance through which the wicked demons are of a nature to actualize evil, delusion, and godlessness within us. And then the very last paragraph. But God is called the head of Christ, since the intellect by nature is the principle according to cause of the word.
Thank you all. Thank you all. That last 25.9, it makes me wonder if Maximus doesn't number these paragraphs and form them to remind us that 10 words can be as important to contemplate and partake of as 500. Yeah. But God is the head of Christ, since the nous by physis is the nous according to aitia of the logos. Or is the logos according to aitia of the logos. It's like a play on communion in that sentence. I want to just turn back to 25.5 and 25.6 for one moment, please. I want to just kind of hone in on a few moments and point to what it seems Maximus is doing in the text for our comprehension, and then we'll move on to question 26. First, in the first kind of 10, 15 lines of 25.5, this is page 165. 4 lines in, we read, is understood in a manner beyond knowledge, or to speak strictly, whose uncovered head is the word of faith known in a manner beyond intellection. And then Scholia 7, understand the phrase in a manner beyond intellection according to preeminence. For our faith, by which he means God, is a reality beyond intellection. So it's pointing to both the kinesis of that thing he's describing and the stasis of it at the same time. He's putting into motion, into articulation, what we have been striving to surmise as apophatic movement. And then the next sentence, above this, such an intellect places nothing from beings, and so on. Above this, to place is a question of thesis, right? To have a thesis means to place something down, or to offer something, or to contribute to a hierarchy. When we try to reorder what we apprehend, and we think, oh, no, I'm going to put that on top of that. That's, no. My harmony obtains. We've mistaken a hierarchy. A few lines down. Inasmuch as it cooperates with the praiseworthy and transcendent privation, which that inasmuch as it enters into that place of truth, that clearing, blessings and goodness abound. That's what that sentence means. Inasmuch as it cooperates with the praiseworthy and transcendent privation, which means the clearing of superabundance, which transcends both itself and beings, and is preeminently divinizing. Preeminently means kind of first by its light, or we can talk about that word after because it's really important for Maximus in what we're reading today. And then just after that, the wife of this intellect is the mind which purifies itself of every sensory image, inasmuch as it has the intellect as its head, thickly covered with intuitions, without origin and beyond understanding of ineffable and unknowable doctrines. This is Maximus phrasing the mystery of Christ. And he's phrasing the mystery. He says, without origin and beyond understanding of ineffable and unknowable doctrines. Everything that he's doing here is drawing us into that place of truth, that place of being with Christ, a place of clearing, of clarity. But it's without origin and beyond understanding and ineffable and unknowable. That's how we approach it. So, and then, over the next page towards the end of 25.5, I pointed out that that one needs to be released from the apprehension and diversity, or the apprehension of diversity and quantity. We become imprinted with the type of the world. We take the as too seriously when we mistake how it is gathered together. The gather and the concentration, which we said is part of the essence, or presence rather. It's how we gather things within ourselves and unto ourselves, and how we gather ourselves unto things and unto the divine. That means either we're drawing near to the simplicity of God or not. Then in 25.6, just at the bottom of 166, when he gives this very, very extraordinarily subtle assessment of our for the sake of, he says, 6 lines up. Every intellect engaged in the exercise of natural contemplation, when it either prays or prophesies with its head covered, that is, when it cognitively seeks after the principles of beings or imparts them to others through teaching, along with any kind of inclination, and then following this, in any manner whatsoever, toward anything but the goal consistent with piety. This is how, as it were, pure or clear or for the sake of has to be. The slightest inclination, the subtlest of diffusion of our energy affects the soul synergy. And if we cognitively seek after the principles of beings or impart them to others through teaching, those are beautiful things. But they are as calling without any dwelling appropriately, if we are not of Christ's truth, if that's not our center. And then just over the page, final couple comments. The last bit of 25.6. 6 lines down from the top of 167. And every intellect that has become a lover of mystical theology, when it prays or prophesies with its head covered, that is, if, when seeking without cognition to enter into the innermost contemplations, i.e., when seeking without humility, right? Or when teaching and initiating others into theology, it should introduce some intelligible form in the course of being initiated or initiating, i.e., without reverence, dishonors its head, placing the one who is simple and who transcends every intellection, every noetic move, beneath a created being or object of knowledge. Whereas without eyes, it must see the true word of God naked. We've been using the word sheer, but naked is good. Sheer is good too. Naked of every concept and knowledge, knowing clearly that, declaring. In the case of God, it is rather the preeminent privations which hold true. The word preeminent there we could query, but preeminent privations which hold true, and to a certain extent affirm something positive of the divine through the complete negation of beings. Now there's a footnote there, right? The phrase, and to a certain extent affirm something positive of the divine, we're told that it literally is, to a certain extent disclose the divine affirmation. Disclose, clarify. So the negation is a clarification of what is there. I mean, again, we lament that we don't have the Greek here. It would deepen our reading quite a bit, I think. Okay. So negation, disclosure, clearing. And then just the idea of untethered at the end, 4 lines up from the end. Its head uncovered, that is, untethered from its noetic power. Untethered just seems to me to be without ground, without stasis, without foundation in lived tradition, without foundation in intimate union or in beautiful communion, i.e. there's no dwelling. If we're untethered, we're just calling, but we're unmoored, we're untethered, we're drifting as we call. So some thoughts there. Let's keep moving. Let's keep moving. To question 26. And I want to just say a few words by way of introduction, and then we'll read several sections and then a few musings. This question and response are about healing or wholeness, and really about response. In a way, it's a meditation on suffering or on undergoing something or on experiencing, as we've seen. Remember the word pascha and passivity. And it's about the idol of as, or the incarnation of sensation as a conceit. A lot of times here, Maximus is mainly talking about people who are trying to do decent things, but they get caught up in their own conceit. Conceit, it means that it's not conceived, it's not together, it's not something beautiful out of communion. It's myself turned into myself, producing my own image of myself. It's a completely dead end. Maximus says that humility is our path of healing. He also talks about inclination here, inclination of mind. And involved in this is the question of letting. Why does God let things happen? Why does he let us list in this way or that way, sway this way? What does letting mean? In Hamlet, Hamlet says, let be. And somehow let and be are words very close to each other. Somehow. Let and be. But actually, David Jennings and Michael Burke, if I could ask you to read a handful of sections here. Jennings, if I could ask you, I believe, to read the question and then paragraphs 22.6 and 26.2 and 26.3, and then Michael 26.4, 26.5, and 26.6, please. It's about 2 pages altogether. When you're ready, please.
Question 26. If the king of Babylon allegorically represents the devil, why does God, through the prophet Jeremiah, threaten the kings of the nations and the king of Judah with chains, bonds, famine, death, the sword, and captivity if they refuse to serve him, while those who serve him willingly, it says, will live freely in their land? And why does God call the devil his servant, saying, I have given the whole earth to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and I have given him the wild beasts to serve him? What is this servitude of the devil? And what are these beasts? What are the 6 kinds of threats? And who are the kings of the nations? And who is the king of Judah? Response. The devil is both God's enemy and God's avenger. He is God's enemy when he appears in his hatred for God, somehow to have acquired a love for us human beings that is destructive, persuading our power of free choice through pleasure and modes of voluntary passions to value what is transitory more than eternal good things. In this way, stealing the whole of the soul's appetite for God, he utterly separates us from divine love, making us willing enemies of the one who created us. He is an avenger, on the other hand, when, inasmuch as we have become subject to him on account of our sins, he lays bare his hatred for us and demands our chastisement. For nothing pleases the devil so much as a man being chastised. This being granted to him, he devises one salt of involuntary suffering after another, like a raging storm, and, with God's permission, cruelly attacks those over whom he has received authority, not because he wishes to carry out God's command, but because he desires to satisfy the passion of his hatred for us, so that, when the weakened soul stumbles under the great weight of its painful misfortunes, it might lose its capacity to hope in God, reckoning the onslaught of all the things it has so grievously suffered, not as a divine admonishment, but as a reason to deny the existence of God altogether. 26.3. For inasmuch as God is good, and wishes completely to uproot from us the seed of evil, that is, the pleasure that robs the intellect of God's love, he allows the devil to inflict sufferings and chastisements on us, using the soul's pains to scrape away the poison of past pleasure and installing within us hatred and utter revulsion for the things of this present life, which pander to the senses alone, for which we have acquired these things, we gain nothing from their use save chastisement. For God wishes to make the devil's power of chastisement and hatred for human beings the contingent cause of the return to virtue in those who by their free choice, their own free choice, fell away from it.
26.4. Thus, insofar as the devil has permission to chastise sinners, he is called a servant of God, even though he is an apostate and a malicious thief. He possesses, moreover, very much the same inclination of mind as those who have willingly distanced themselves from God through sensual pleasure. For it is fitting and just that those who have gladly accepted his evil suggestions to commit sins through their own volition should also be punished by him. For through our voluntary passions, the devil is the sower of pleasure, and through our involuntary passions, he is the inflictor of pain. 26.5. When the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem, that is, those who, seeking the glory of men, abandon the habitual state of mind acquired through ascetic practice or contemplative understanding, and adopt instead a superficial manner of virtuous behavior, uttering words of wisdom and knowledge without the corresponding works of righteousness, and when in addition they display to others their vanity because of their supposed virtue and knowledge, then they are rightly handed over to suitable hardships, thereby learning through suffering the humility that was previously unknown to them because of their vain conceit. Having this in mind, the admirable Apostle Paul handed over to Satan the Corinthian who had transgressed the law onto the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit might be saved on the day of the Lord Jesus. By the same logic, the king of Judea and Jerusalem are handed over to the king of the Assyrians, that is, the contemplative and cognitive intellect is given to the devil for chastisement, and he justly inflicts on it sufferings and misfortunes, so that through suffering it might learn to philosophize about endurance and patience in sufferings, instead of boasting vainly and arrogantly about things that do not exist. 26.6. I'll read the Scholia first, it might be worth thinking about later. Scholia 5, which comes at the partway through the first sentence. Whoever suffers, he says, for having transgressed the grace of God and recognizes the principle of divine providence that is healing him, accepts the affliction with joy and gratitude and corrects the fault for which he is being disciplined. But if he is insensitive to this treatment, he is justly deprived of the grace that was once given him and is handed over to the confusion of the passions. And he is abandoned so that he may acquire by ascetic labor those things for which he inwardly longs. 26.6. It follows then that anyone who is aware of his actions and who willingly endures to accept with due thankfulness the painful inflictions of involuntary trials is not exiled from his state of grace according to virtue and knowledge, as happened to the men of Judea and Jerusalem, because he has submitted willingly to the yoke of the king of Babylon and pays his debt, as it were, by accepting the inflictions of torments. In this way, while remaining in a state of grace according to virtue and knowledge, he pays tribute to the king of Babylon, not only with his compulsory sufferings, which have arisen within the passible side of his nature, but also with his mental assent to these sufferings, accepting them as his due on account of his former offenses, and through his true worship, by which I mean through his humble disposition, he offers to God the correction of his errors.
Thank you both. That Scholia 5, Michael, reminds me of the tale from the desert when the monk spent 7 years praying for a certain gift, and then God granted it to him, and it was too much. So he spent 7 years praying that it would be removed, and God granted him this, and he was at peace.
That's, I mean, underlying that narrative, and I think underlying the very tension, mystery of providence, which doesn't in any way compromise or extinguish or interfere with synergy and agency. I think this reflects on the nature of grace. A principle of divine providence that heals us and that provides for a contrast obviously is incompatible with a kind of blunt materialist determinism, or a kind of projection of that blunt deterministic materialism into that which is beyond our comprehension, namely God's providence. So it's a wonderfully illuminating and probably in some sectors corrective gloss on the very idea of divine providence.
When you stick with necessity, you're staying with the as. Let's go back to the beginning of those passages we heard and just reflect on kind of three general kind of tendencies, and then we'll move on to question 27. The first bit of the response, paragraph 22.6, the devil is both God's enemy and God's avenger. We pay attention to the terms is and as and is called and inasmuch in these first paragraphs, because it's very important. Maximus is speaking carefully here. Here, I think he is talking about how we figure and mistake the as, or sensation, or aesthesis, when we consider it to be beautiful or terrible on its own, right? Beautiful or terrible. Here, it's the terrible bit on its own. And so he's from the beginning, he's reminding us that our comprehension of things is in terms of our own given tropos, our own form, movement, time, sense of relationship. So, of course, to speak of the devil in terms of God's enemy and God's avenger is very, very strange. But we're not speaking in terms of is, we're speaking in terms of as, and there's going to be a reason. Also in this first bit, he says, in this way, stealing the whole of the soul's appetite for God, he utterly separates us. That's beautiful. If you disfigure one's appetite instead of transfiguring their desire, then you have them on the whole. The call is mistaken. And then just over towards the last few lines of 26.2, when he says, nothing pleases the devil so much as a man being chastised, and then what follows from that, culminating, when the weakened soul stumbles over the great weight of its painful misfortunes, it might lose its capacity to hope, right? Reckoning these things not as divine admonishment, but as a reason to deny the existence of God altogether. This is astonishing. If the call comes from something beautiful, and then we begin to actively think of what is beautiful as non-beautiful, as not of God, we're in a terrible state. The devil rejects hope, has no hope, and he seeks that we dwell with him in hopelessness. How does this happen? By making our sense of beautiful meaning to be identified with our own sense of happiness. Right? That is, we see meaning only in terms of our own measure, our own mortal measure, unto death, not within the horizon of Christ. As soon as we see things in terms of ourselves, there's no hope at all. We're alone. We're turned inwards and unto death. And then the bottom of that page, just the beginning of 26.4. So just to continue from, thus insofar, another insofar as, so we're in the realm of as aesthetic, as the devil has permission, we're speaking as, to chastise sinners, he is called, the is called. Yeah, fair enough. Even though he is an apostate and a malicious thief. So as, okay, that's one level, is called, when we give into that beauty, thinking that's of God without realizing the is, then we're in trouble. When we divorce the calls from the dwells. So that's first. Second here, Maximus says, where is it? Oh, he possesses, moreover, very much the same inclination of mind as those who have willingly distanced themselves from God through self-love. In the passage David read last time that we focused on a little bit, an inclination is important, right? The slightest inclination. Here, what is Maximus saying? He's saying the inclination, the cast of our mind, our movement unto, our disposition, our flow, our drawing near, that is what's at stake. Not our ideas, not our notions, but how we respond, and therefore how we co-respond. Right? Because if we can be disfigured in the form of our being, in our tropos, then we're disfigured. We're not transfigured. We're far ways from the clearing in which we are transfigured. And we disfigure our mode of being when we, well, as it were, follow the devil. Okay, let's move on to question 27. Not to step too lightly, but because we need to keep going. Now, a few thoughts, and then David, I'm hoping to ask you to please read paragraphs 27 actually, the question, and then 27.2, 0.3, and 0.4. That's all. So 27, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. Let's just begin reading, if you will, David. Go read the question, and then 27.2, 3, 4, and if you have wind in your lungs, 5. But if it's time to start musing, then just that.
Since the Lord, after the resurrection, clearly commanded the apostles to make disciples of all the nations, why did Peter need a revelation concerning the nations from Cornelius? And why did the other apostles, upon hearing of what took place with Cornelius, criticize Peter? The response. The leader of the apostles, the all-holy Peter, had great need of a divine revelation concerning the nations, since he did not realize that, with respect to the faith, there is no distinction to be made between circumcision and non-circumcision. Neither was he certain that the Lord said to make disciples of the nations without the external cultic service prescribed by the law. He did not clearly understand any of these things until the mystery of the ineffable counsel was manifest to him through a revelation, persuading him through the example of the sheet, as well as through the grace of the Holy Spirit, which was given equally to him and to the nations according to faith alone, that in the worship of Christ, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The other apostles in Jerusalem were likewise ignorant of this and criticized him until they too learned the hidden treasure of divine goodness that had been lavished on all mankind. And there's a scholia there. He says that the mystery proclaimed by the New Testament is a change of life, angelic worship, the willing estrangement of the soul from the body, and the beginning of benign renewal in the spirit. The text. For the grace transmitted by the preaching of the gospel was at once the introduction of divine life and new service, in contrast to the service of the law. Instruction for the soul willingly inclined to detach itself from the body, and the abrogation of the beginning of a new and more divine source of birth. For this reason, all those entrusted with the ministry required, for their every word, the instruction of him who commanded them to preach. (27:3). Though I may appear to be inquiring into these matters beyond what is proper, permit me to say that every word of a divine commandment stands in absolute need of instruction and revelation for the realization of its determined manner of application. The Scholia 2. The word of a commandment, he says, is one thing, and the application by means of which the commandment is realized is another. The great Peter, having received the command to preach to the nations, was ignorant of the manner of the commandment's application, which he was taught through the vision of the sheet, namely, that the calling of the nations must not include circumcision or any of the other corporal rites of the law. For there is a spiritual circumcision, which is the cutting away of the soul's impassioned relations to the body. Back to the text. For the grace transmitted by the preaching of the gospel was at once the introduction of divine life and new service, in contrast to the service of the law, instruction for the soul willingly inclined to detach itself from the body, and the adumbrations of the beginning of a new and more divine source of birth. For this reason, I'm sorry, I'm repeating this, aren't I? For this reason, all those entrusted with this ministry require, for their very word, the instruction of him who committed them to preach. 27:3. So I may appear to be inquiring into these matters beyond what is proper. Permit me to say that every word of a divine commandment stands in absolute need of instruction and revelation for the realization of its determinate manner of application. For nowhere does there exist anyone who can know the manner in which a word is to be applied without a revelation from the one who uttered the word. The all-praiseworthy Peter knew this, and though he had already received the word of the Lord to preach the gospel to the nations, he did not undertake this task, but was waiting to be instructed in the manner of the word's application by the one who gave the word. 27:4. But perhaps there were other things in addition to these that the great Peter was taught by the sheet which descended from heaven, as well as by the different animals contained within it. Or I should say, the whole human race, and not just Peter, who through faith had attained the divine summit, having expressly learned to extinguish completely his entire power of sensation. Because for so long as his perception of visible realities was dominated by sensation, he understood that in and of itself, God's creation contains its own destruction. For by itself, it was not able to be free of corruption and confusion. Thus, by means of the sheet and the animals contained within it, the one who spoke to him revealed to him through the invisible world, the visible world conceived on the level of its inner principles, or the invisible world made visible by means of its sensible figurations, which is suitable for spiritual food. This is why he told him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And from where he is commanded to, and from where is he commanded to rise? From where else, if not from the habitual state of mind and relation bound to sensation, and from the earth-bound opinion concerning beings, or from the supposed righteousness given by the law? God's purpose was that Peter, in his intellect alone, by his intellect alone, having rid himself of every mental image arising from sense perception, and being able to behold the principles of sensible realities, marked of their outward forms, grasping the figures of intelligible realities, might learn that none of the things brought into existence by God is unclean. In the Scholia 3, whoever does not stop short on the outward forms that visible realities present to the senses, but seeks with his intellect, his nous, to contemplate their inner principles, seeing them as features of intelligible realities or the inner principles of sensible creations, will be taught that nothing belonging to the visible world is unclean. For by nature, all things were created exceedingly good. For anyone, back to the main text, for anyone who has contemplated the visible creation manifest through the inner principles of the intelligible world, or who has seen the figures of intelligible realities through the beautiful order of visible things, like a sheet descending from heaven, would never believe that any visible reality is unclean, for he beholds no opposition in the inner principles of beings. This is because the corruption of things that have come into existence, and the war between them takes place on the level of sensation. Well, in their inner principles, there's absolutely nothing contrary or in opposition. 27:5. The sheet signifies the sensible world, composed of four principles, as if from four elements, by which it is also governed. The reptiles, wild animals, and birds of the air represent the different inner principles of the things that have been brought into being, principles that are unclean as regards sense perception, but in themselves are clean and nutritious and sustain intelligible life. The voice heard 3 times respectively teaches practical, natural, and theological philosophy. For one must rise, not once, but twice and a third time, to kill the creation made of visible realities in order to eat it cognitively, obeying God wholly and sincerely. Scalia 4. He who is not changed, he says, together with the motion of sensible things, practices the virtues in a manner that is truly pure. He who does not permit the outward forms of sensible things to imprint themselves on his intellect has received the true understanding of beings. He whose mind has outstripped the very essence of beings has, as an excellent theologian, come close to the monad through unknowing. It follows that the one who has thrice killed within himself the creation made of visible realities has become worthy of the rank of the perfect. Back to the main text. First, he who rises from a disposition passionately attached to visible things kills their motion, and by ascetic practice eats virtue. Second, he who rises from false opinions about beings kills the outward form of visible realities and eats their invisible principles, achieves natural contemplation in the spirit. Third, he who rises from the error of polytheism kills the very essence of created beings and by faith eats the cause of those beings and is filled with a power to theologize. Therefore, every intellect engaged in contemplation, having in hand the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, and having put to death within itself the motion of the visible creation, has achieved virtue, and having cut off its mental images of outward sensible forms, has discovered truth in the inner principles of created being, the very truth that is constitutive of natural contemplation. Moreover, by transcending the essence of created things, the intellect is enlightened by the divine and invincible monad, the very enlightenment that is constitutive of the mystery of true theology.
Amen. Thank you, David. The mysteries Maximus points to in that last paragraph are extraordinarily beautiful. A couple of comments about the thing on the whole, and then point to it, just one or two things, and let's begin talking. This question and response is about the horizon of the gift, the horizon, and in particular becoming attuned to the horizon. And what do we notice about the image of the gift here? On the sheet or in the clearing, there's no negation necessary. No negation is necessary. Also, in terms of co-response or co-responding, when we begin to sense, feel, Maximus says, the beauty of creation, or the beauty rather appropriate to creation, then our being responds. We begin to join in the transfiguration, which it properly is, and then correspondence deepens into harmony, which deepens into communion. A few particular kind of considerations of passages. The beginning of 27.3, when he, as it were, borrows a phrase from St. Gregory of Nazianzus, though I may appear to be inquiring into these matters beyond what is proper, and so on. This is about humility and reverence in a way. He's saying there's no one way transferal of meaning. One must begin to correspond with it. It's framed in English in terms of commandment and application, but those are clumsy terms next to of and as. He's talking about the mystery of and as. We know this is of God, but how will it be incarnate with us? That's what he's saying. How does it become incarnate with us? And so it's about the mystery of completion in the Holy Spirit, as it were. Then in 27.4, just at the bottom of that page, of page 183, and just over to 184, he talks about that in and of itself, God's creation contained its own destruction. Well, yeah, as its own, i.e., just as matter, our world is a world unto death, as is everything considered alone as mere matter. And it reminds us that the term as alone, without an of, without relationship, gives us idolatry, or the place of non-life. But if we perceive the of God in the as creatures, as creation, then our participation of the world in the world is healed. And then just following in that paragraph, the remarkable image of the sheet and Maximus's account of the recovery of visible creation, the beauty of visible creation. There's an affirmation of sensible reality here. And here we see the as and the of, or aesthesis and noesis, drawn together and transfigured. And when we see how what is incarnate is of God, how what we see as being is of God, then we're in the place of true beauty, as well as of true making. This week I was speaking with Ahmed, and he said, you know, in that movement between the of and the as is the moment of creation, of making, of artistry. And that's true, because in the moment of unto or between of and as unto of, and of unto as, it's the communion of creation. And then just one final thought. this last paragraph, the remarkable rise, kill, and eat meditation. Rise, stand forth, kill, encounter for the sake of, and eat, integrate into the appropriate dance. It seems to me that this is a really, really lovely allegory, other way of saying the gathering unto, the apophatic gathering unto, the gathering which is not just a gathering for its own, but a gathering for the sake of another beyond itself, which is the form of beauty which we know. Okay, let's begin speaking. We've been reading and talking a long time. There are three questions which may give us a jumping point, or we may just begin wherever we please. There's no need to follow anyone. The first question, which is linked to the last Maximus question, question 27, is how is the idea of casting related to synergy? So casting in the sense of a cast of mind, or a forecast, or a casting forth, searching for something, but also in the sense of symbol means things are cast together. So being cast and then being joined with another thing is at the heart of symbol, the heart of meaning. How is the way in which we cast our being with others related to synergy? The form with which we are present to the world. How is that related to synergy? The second question, which is related to question 26 with Maximus, is when do we intercede in what we perceive, and why do we intercede? What does it mean to intercede, especially in a conceit? Maximus in this question has talked about conceits. And the third question has to do with intimacy, and it's related to question 25 and Maximus. Intimacy, he figures it in terms of movement unto, in terms of appropriate belonging within hierarchy, in terms of kind of purity. So if movement is often figured in terms of, if intimacy is often figured in terms of movement unto another, what does intimacy have to do with stasis? In other words, what does calling have to do with dwelling? Let's begin here or where we please. Micah, you began to think earlier and then you paused your thoughts so we could continue reading. But there are many avenues that we could begin to walk down together.
I don't know if anyone would like to, and Andrew drew our attention to the very last, very short aphoristic paragraph in question 25. And it's not just added, it seems to reflect on a lot of the, on a number of the previous paragraphs. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, but I'll just read it out again, see if anything stirs in anyone. But God is called to the head of Christ, since the intellect, and the intellect is referring back to God, so that's quite striking. So God is being equated with the nous. Since the intellect by nature is the principle of the Logos, which is Christ. So I don't have any particular thoughts, but it is an arresting comparison I mean, God is the head, the nous, and is the principle of the logos, so that it's I mean, in some of the preceding paragraphs, maybe this will just kind of emphasize something. There is this is a kind of starkly apophatic response to the question in 25. There's this sense that nothing in our perceptions, intellect, reason, anything can come close to approximating, capturing God. I'm paraphrasing very, very roughly here, but there's a striking qualification, it seems to me, that's embedded in that aphorism, especially when it relates back to, for example, toward the end of paragraph 25.5 on page 166, when there's reference to the, or this really just kind of emphasizes what is in that aphorism. This clause, since he shows that the intellect subsists in himself, God, essentially. Now that's extraordinarily striking, because it's also the case that human intellect can't, divinization participates in the energeia of God, but not in his essence. That's what we encountered last week. And here, the qualification that I was referring to is that human intellect, insofar as it's derived from sensation, and we can extend that to empirical perception and therefore all of science, is an inadequate form of the intellect, it seems, which is almost something impossible for modern imagination to conceive. But it arrests the temptation to think of, the ancients had the notion of the cosmos, which was the notion that it was an ordered reality, not as some nihilistic people today might be, think that everything that we perceive through the senses is just a series of patterns which science arbitrarily organizes. So that thought is antithetical to the ancient conception out of which arguably modern science came, which is that there is a kind of order to the universe. But here we're informed of something even more, that the God that is the principle of the logos is nous. And nous can't be wished away as simply a kind of ordering principle. It's obviously something that is inherently intentional, real, a person. Anyway, I'm just sort of throwing out ideas, hoping that someone will either react to what I say or shift us in a more fluent stream of thought.
I have a response, but I've spoken a lot, so I want to. Well, just let me say a couple words in general, but then I think trying to hone in on what you're saying. Something we haven't talked about yet, and it's I didn't prepare for this. It just comes to mind now. I've thought about it a lot, but I don't have any thoughts prepared. Is that we haven't kind of considered Maximus's method on the whole, or the Christian method on the whole. And I don't mean anything sophisticated by that. By method, I mean what the Greek, the higher way, the path, the holy path. right? So not routine, nothing mundane. Method, meta, odos, the higher way, right? It's a holy thing. When sometimes it seems that Maximus is saying, really, you just have to have clearer vision, right? But that's not Christian, that's Platonic. And sometimes it seems that Maximus is saying, you have to find the origin of the movement. What's the spark, right? But that's Aristotelian. That's not Christian either, right? And in this last, in 25.9, which you returned us to, which I really love, I think that in a way Maximus is responding to this sort of way of thinking, of being trapped. Okay, so then what we're talking about is being trapped within a way of thinking of God as intellect, God as logos, God as judge, God as lover, God as the as, right? And when we get trapped in that, we're in idolatry. And it strikes me that I think this is fair to say. In Christianity, although we have some few carefully chosen, as it were, names for God, they're names which don't stand alone. It's not nous, it's not logos, it's not spirit, you know, in a sense. It's a calling into relationship of. So our naming of God is both a calling and a dwelling. They call to each other. It's a form of Father and Son is relation, Spirit is relation. And so what he's doing here is, I think, illuminating by way of an anagogy, or maybe an analogy or analogy, how we understand what that highest of relationships possibly means. He says, God, okay, well, I'm not going to use Greek strictly here because we don't have the Greek in front of us and we want to be very, very careful. But we can get close, right? So God probably Theos is the head of Christ. Okay, fair enough, Christ. Since the nous by nature, by physis, is the principle, probably logos, but maybe not, but probably, according to cause, and cause is probably aitia, like aetiology, A-I-T-I-A, of the logos. Now, Dionysius often uses the word cause for God, and we get the sense that when Maximus capitalizes the word cause with a capital C, which he does sometimes here, then he is kind of hearkening back to Dionysius' vision. Dionysius was not an Aristotelian, though. He gave us the whole idea of movement beyond itself, of apophasis in a true sense. So this cause is not really Aristotelian. I think it's more Dionysian in that sense. This is the last thing he's saying after spending a lot of time talking about men and women and more palpable things. So God is called it's strange to us. God is called the head of Christ, but the idea of the head of Christ has been strange to us throughout the whole thing. So God is called the head of Christ so that is the same thing as insofar as we can imagine in our images that this is also another relationship. Just as the intellect is by nature the principle according to cause of the word, so that which is manifested, which comes as being, is of according to cause. So it's kind of purely of the nous. And we've talked about the nous as that place of communion with the divine. It's a place of synergy. And I think that's about as well as one might, well, not one, I can phrase it right now. If one tries to keep paraphrasing, I might get caught up thinking, oh, this way of saying it is right. But you're pointing to a deep mystery, and the mystery is somehow in the relation of words, the dance, which points beyond itself. It's an apophatic pointing beyond. It's there, it's only there. That's all we have, but it's beyond that too. Oh.
No, I think that's very, very important what you've carefully laid out. I just mentioned in passing, hoping to apprehend any kind of misconstrual that as I mentioned last week, how we can approach energies of God, but the essence of God. I mean, that was quite striking when we encountered that thought. The essence of God is not something we can capture. And so here's one thought. If we're, I mean, being made in the image of God, obviously a lot could be said about that. But if so creativity sometimes is regarded as, certainly looking at the God of early Genesis, creativity is sometimes thought of as that faculty that makes us, places us in the image of God. But the intellect, presumably, is used in the sense as a creative faculty, but it's made in the image of God exercising. See, it's awkward to speak this way, but of God embodying the intellect through his energies, and any use of our intellect is, of course, derived from, it's derived from revelation, but it's always tempered with our perceptions and sensations and what have you. So it's not as though it's some kind of route to understanding God, in which case the intermediary of the logos would almost be redundant. So it's a sense that the logos can't possibly be a construction, because it is itself a kind of manifestation of nous. Now it's awkward if I were just to assert this outside of this context, but obviously there is a kind of apophatic reception of all of these ideas. But it's quite striking where, when he does refer to the nous as essentially in dwelling in, I better get this right. But when in this passage he says that the intellect subsists in himself, in God, essentially, it obviously doesn't exhaust. Nothing can exhaust God. Certainly not any of our, characterizations, which is when we're using the word nous, it becomes a characterization. But it's more than that, because it's a characterization that, if we handle it properly, lets us understand that the intellect is something that is beyond us. And of course it is. It's because the alternatives seem to be that it's simply something that we are colliding molecules and cells and everything, construct something. We want to call that the nous, but it's not an empirical concept, obviously, any more than agency or meaning or truth. So it is itself a kind of revelatory entity. But if it subsists essentially in the divine, then of course it's not anything that we could capture and formulate and make a research project,
Michael, I think as radical as that is, I think when you combine it to 27.3, you really get something, and that is not really get something like what you just said was really something, but this is where Maximus, prefiguring Bart, says, for nowhere does there exist anyone who can know the manner in which a word is to be applied without a revelation from the one who uttered the word.
Wow.
I mean, and then you combine that with 25.9, that of God, the intellect. Like this is a radical understanding. I mean, we have been reading Maximus, where he speaks of reason and the shedding of the passions and the pursuing of reason, etc. But here we have this radical statement that there isn't anything said to you that can be understood other than through revelation. And then, of course, the highest point of that is what you just talked about in 25.9, when God is the Word, is the intellect, which is the first principle of the Word. Of course, only through revelation that we will know this. I mean, theologically, I think it's both correct, but I mean, it is a very sharpened stick of theology, of hermeneutics that speaks to that.
Yeah, because you could also use it to, I think this is, I hope this doesn't sound too crass, but a kind of useful stratagem for Christians not to be back-footed. Because obviously, I guess the context here is understanding scripture, that's the immediate context, but I think you could extend it so that we, a challenge for, I don't want to encompass all atheists, but atheists who have a physicalist view of reality, or an entirely kind of reductive natural view of reality, that the principle is radical because we can't even understand human-made sentences, or the sentences passing back and forth between us right this moment. If the incarnation isn't a reality.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to run long before we get down Wittgensteinian language games, but I think that what it also does for the Christian community is imbues a radical humility. The sense of certainty has to always be caught, and Peter does this himself in community. Is he thought it was one way, and then has a dream or a revelation, and it's exactly the opposite way. And he's humble enough to hear it and then test it within the community of faith. And they themselves also have this revelation. That's, probably, I can't speak to the world church, but I can certainly speak to, I think, a good portion of the North American church, and that level of humility with revelation, I think, is often lacking.
Just a couple of things in response to that. I've appreciated how you've unfolded this. But when we look at the sweep of these three texts, the Word is made flesh. The Word has to become embodied. It's not enough just to have it. His reflection on the revelation. Peter had the revelation, but he had to wait on what the mode of speaking about that would be, and how that then needs to be made flesh in our relationships in the world. So the nous, what you were talking about, Michael, as, I mean, this curious way in which he's speaking about the nous as perhaps the well, I like what I think Andrew said it. I mean, I'm on dangerous ground here, but let me just suggest this, that the nous is within each of us, as the holy place is within the temple. It is the place of the presence. It's the place of the presence. And whether we are alert to that or not is another matter. But it's the place of the presence of God. And and so to say that it shares in the essence of God is a way of trying to probe that a little bit. But we have to realize that the central discipline about the essence of God is, David just spoke about it, humility. That is, it is the place of no presumption. The moment there is presumption, you've turned it into something else. And in the earlier part of the first question we were reading, I mean, my God, it is a judgment on the way in which we work. I mean, the way in which we normally usually work and go about the world. And taken all together, I mean, it does seem to me to be well, they're all texts that they leave me a little bit breathless, not quite sure what to do with them outside of, say,
Oh, sorry. Can I just throw this out quickly, just to be sure? I just want to, be quite emphatic about this. I mean, Maximus, of course, would not encourage us to entertain the idea that we're made in the image of God's essence. I mean, our nous can't possibly broach that divide. So, and that's useful to remember. So when we're using the word nous as something, if we're made in the image of God, and nous represents God as one way of configuring God, then we're made in the image of the energies, energies that nous manifests. We're not getting to the essence of God. So I just want to, that would be the kind of ontological imposition of humility, whether we recognize it or not. So our finite nous, of course, will always be something radically distinct, even though it's made in the image of God. Otherwise, what I was saying, I think, is sort of obliterating the whole apophatic.
One of the great
our readings.
Pardon me. One of the great teachers of intimacy after Maximus, Gregory Palamas, in our tradition, says that we only ever know the energies of God, but we know them really, and so we know God really. But no, you're as far as I understand, you're sound in how you phrase that. But I bow to David and others here. But that's well put.
Can I move to another question I have? And sorry, guys, it's dinner time was a little while ago, so I got to run. It's being 4 hours ahead of you. In 25.2, he starts off, well, of course, I mean this, but I really wonder. First of all, I don't think his argument requires this, but I'm wondering if this is consistent with what I thought I've read in Maximus elsewhere. And this is his point that when he says, when I say man, that the divine apostle, that Christ is the head of every man, obviously it means every believing man who's engaged in the practice of divine commandments and who contemplates pious doctrines, because the inclusive sense of the word does not include men who are not believers. For how could Christ be the head of those who do not believe in him? I think our theology, and I thought Maximus, like, Christ is king of the cosmos. He's king. Now, query whether or not a man doesn't recognize the kingship, that he is a subject who either intentionally disobeys the law or through ignorance doesn't think he knows the law. But I don't think that has any impact on Christ's kingship. And I don't think that's consistent with what I think we've read before in Maximus, although, I can't give you chapter and verse, but the cap our reality is that Christ is king of the cosmos. Colossians, in and through and by and for all things created are for Christ. So I don't think his kingship is in any way affected by the subjective understanding by any human as to whether or not he is in fact king. Anyway, am I missing something in Maximus that's important, or was this simply, he would have had to have this qualification later on with all of the men and the women in order to make the argument. I get that. He would have had to push it there, but I don't think he had to surrender the kingship of Christ to make his argument.
I don't think in this passage he's doing that, David. You're absolutely right in what you're saying. But in this passage, he's playing with these images of how we think of God as the head of Jesus Christ, and then this image in Paul of man and woman, and really it has nothing to do with men and women. It has everything to do with the inner workings of our own being,
right,
which he's using this kind of these images to speak about different aspects of the human nature. So I read it. I can understand that if you pull it out like that, you wonder about that, but you're absolutely right in saying this isn't Maximus. That's not what he's doing. He's playing with these images within the context of what he wants to unfold in this question, which is how are these things at play within us, within our nous, our sensation, our relationships, and what's the relationship between them?
Yeah. Okay. And I guess rhetorically I wouldn't have done it at the very beginning, but I'm not Maximus, and he probably counts on a patience of readers that I'm when I first encountered that, I was quite thrown off it.
I understand that. And
yeah,
it raised my eyebrows as well. And also I would go even further and say, what does he mean by man here? I would, part of me wants to say, well, you're speaking about the human nature here, or you're speaking about personhood here. But those are things that the whole tradition's been working with for a long time. So
anyway, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to say goodbye. It's
great to
my
see
wife
you,
has
David.
been extremely patient, but it's 7:00, so I gotta run, guys. Anyway, great chatting with you. See you in a couple of weeks.
Ciao, David. Ciao.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Shall we draw to a close? Let's draw to a close.
Well, that was a bit dense, huh?